We're reading the entire Bible together, chapter by chapter, looking at a new book of the Bible here. This is cool. I really, 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 if you couldn't tell, liked First Corinthians. And it's one of my favorite books in the New Testament, particularly among Paul's letters. But it's really cool to get back into these stories here because they're not just stories of cool things that happened, though they are stories of cool things that happened. But you just get all this sense of like what was going on and how people of faith lived, and you just see all these. It just makes more connections than a letter can, the way that a story can. And I think we see that today, and we see the connections because Samuel is just one of the most connected figures, I think, in the Bible, just in general. You know, he doesn't really fit the mold for a lot of these things. He's not just a priest. He's not really a king exactly, but in some ways he kind of is that too. He's just like all these sorts of things, and he exists in this weird time in Israel's history when it wasn't during the wilderness wandering, but it wasn't yet in the monarchy with like Saul and David. It was this weird time where the tabernacle was in Shiloh, and it's just, I don't know. In my mind, it's kind of like this Wild West situation. It's really cool, and there's gonna be a lot to talk about today as we get started with the birth of Samuel. We'll see a lot of connections, I think, to John the Baptist and Christ in the New Testament. But without spoiling anything else, I wanted to introduce our guest today. We have got Paul Kane, pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Sheridan, Wyoming, joining us again. Good morning, brother. Happy to have you starting a new book of the Bible with us.
Yeah, I'm very excited to lay the foundation for lots of stories to come.
Yeah, well, and it really is a lot, and maybe more than we realize, because we call these First and Second Samuel. But it's kind of in some ways, it's sort of a weird way of looking at it, because while Samuel is sort of predominant in just First Samuel, he's not really so much in Second Samuel. And in fact, in the Septuagint, we keep going and we call these First, Second, Third, and Fourth Kingdoms.
Right. Originally, what we call First and Second Samuel was one book, unlike First and Second Corinthians in the New Testament. Right. And the break, it's a very fundamental place with the death of King Saul and David becoming king of Judah.
Right. So in that way, it's like you were saying, it really is like just the beginning of many stories, and not just the story of just Samuel. We call it Samuel like it's maybe about him, but it's just Samuel gets the ball rolling. But this is going to be the stories of Samuel, of Saul, of David, of Solomon. I mean, it's just going to keep on going, and it's sort of like the Pentateuch in that way, in that it's not just really about one single figure. It just keeps rolling.
Right. There's so many things that could be said. We don't hear much from Samuel at all in verse 1. It's really the time before his birth and him being given to the Lord. Eli gets introduced here too. There's a lot about him. Samuel is the last of the judges. In a similar way, we often think of John the Baptist as the last of the Old Testament style prophets.
Right. And so in that way, that's another analogy between him and John the Baptist. And there's quite a few, I think. I think that we'll see that later, especially too, how the role of Samuel as the prophet who critiques or holds the king accountable, and how John the Baptist continues that role, even leading up to his death. Truly. Ultimately. And there's just a lot of connections. But I hope to kind of make some of those connections today. Just kind of get a situation about, okay, hang on, well, what's Shiloh again? Why is that where this is all taking place? Why not Jerusalem? Kind of reacquaint ourselves with this stuff that we kind of got a little bit of a taste for when we were reading Joshua. And then also maybe to kind of talk about some of these specific things like, okay, this story, I guess, kind of opens up with this, with this, particular Ephraimite, and why is that significant? And what's the significance really of Samuel's name, which is one of the big parts today. So lots of cool things to be getting into today. But before we get into those things, brother, would you open us up with a prayer?
Certainly. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. God the Father Almighty, maker of all things, you looked on the affliction of your barren servant Hannah, and did not forget her, but answered her prayers with the gift of a son. So hear our supplications and petitions, and fill our emptiness. Grant us trust in your provision, so that we, like Hannah, might render unto you all thankfulness and praise, and delight in the miraculous birth of your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. All right, so just kind of last kind of introductory remarks here before we actually read it. I think the big one you just mentioned, this is the basically the close of the age of the judges, and Samuel's going to be the last judge, and then after him we get kings. So this is a really big moment in big transition in the history of Israel. What else should we be kind of thinking about, just kind of in terms of kind of big stage setting pieces before we read the chapter?
Well, it's hard not to think of Christ as we consider the roles of Samuel in 1 Samuel in particular. You've got lots of talk about altar and priest and king. And Samuel, as the last of the judges, he's priest. He's going to offer a sacrifice being of the tribe of Levi. That comes up in chapter 7. He's definitely a prophet. That's more something for a couple days from now, chapter 3. And he is a kingmaker.
Yep.
And we see this a couple of times in the book. So prophet, priest, and king, these are Christological titles. Samuel prepares the way, and quite the transitional figure, as you've pointed out. Very important to understand him, and sometimes we don't understand him even as well as Nathan and David, or even as well as John the Baptist.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, kind of understanding just how in the middle or transitional, or just kind of how much overlap there is with just kind of the situation and also his own identity and role as we read this. So, you don't want to be thinking to yourself, like, no, hang on a second, is this guy a prophet? Is he a priest, right? Yeah, I mean, where's the king? Like, if we're asking those questions, we might get ourselves thrown off. This is a very fluid, I think maybe that's the best word for it, maybe fluid situation. And also these roles were fluid as well. And so it is a picture, I think, like you were saying, that shows how all these things can be fluidly maintained in Christ, and how it's not like a contradiction or an innovation if we say that he has all these roles, or that he's like the perfect prophet, priest, king, etc. It shows how they all can be held together, actually. But yeah, let's...
Right. There's not a separation of powers as there would be under the American Constitution.
That's right.
Even though he may be a judge, he's more than just the judicial branch.
Well, yeah, and then that's a good point too, right? That the term for judging, right? It's less to do with our sense of judging and more like in the sense that Moses was a judge, right? That Moses would like judge the cases between the people, but that's because functionally he was the king, So I mean, it's just, again, just kind of like you were saying, we shouldn't go and necessarily draw too much analogy to our own political situation, but I think all of this stuff is going to speak to our own political situation in the sense of this is all getting at, really, I think all these, especially opening chapters in 1 Samuel, how do God's people interact with political power? And what's the correct use of political power, and how should we wield it, and to what extent do we need to react to corruption, as we're going to see very quickly here in 1 Samuel, To what extent do we just yield power? So, I mean, like, it is going to, I think, in the end up intersecting our own times and situations a lot. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and read this 1 Samuel chapter 1 in the English Standard Version. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Sophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeraham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and wouldn't eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why don't you eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you've made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. They then slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. So even though Elkanah, her husband, Samuel's father, is in some ways the character that we're introduced to first, really Hannah, I think, is the one who is kind of the star of the show. Not in any way self-aggrandizing, but is kind of the one that we're sympathizing with and we're really tracking with, who's the story is all kind of hinging on here. And we're going to get that next time, especially where you have Hannah's prayer, which is I mean, it's so huge how this just pops up throughout the Bible. It's just it just makes it's a template for so much that comes later. But yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating story because in some ways it's kind of like Ruth, how the story is kind of about a woman in a bad situation, like and we're tracking with her, and she's humble, and we pity her, and it's just kind of striking all by itself, really, that in this ancient context, you've got this story in the Bible. And it's really kind of focused on the plight of this poor woman.
Very much so. In verse 8, her husband sounds kind of tone deaf. Not the most compassionate words that we might expect. From verse 2, we might get the impression that Hannah was the first wife, and then he married another, which is uncomfortable on so many levels.
Yeah.
For us as Christians, we really feel for her. Our hearts go out for her, and we see what her husband tries to do, the double portion, whether that was actually twice as much as the other wife got, isn't as important, but he tried, but boy, he does seem kind of tone deaf in his words. This Ephrathite.
Yeah.
He seems to live there, but looking at 1 Chronicles 6, he's a Levite by tribal affiliation and descent. So he's kind of living where he needs to live, since the Levites didn't really have their own territory like the other tribes.
Right. Yeah, we saw that, especially in Joshua, how the Levites were scattered. They had cities all over the place, and it was by lot that they had certain cities ceded to them from each of the rest of the tribes that had inherited land. And so so even though this takes place in the hill country of Ephraim, as you were saying, the proper tribal affiliation seems to be of Levi, which of course lends itself to the priestly role, and in fact you've got very that priestly role is pretty prominent here also, even not necessarily with Samuel quite yet, but just dealing particularly with Eli, whose sons, we're going to talk more about his sons later, but they're named Hophni and Phinehas, and now Phinehas, that's a particularly prominent name. That was one of the high priests, was the grandson of Aaron, or maybe the great grandson. So we're definitely thinking tribe of Levi. There's a very proper line of succession, and the roles in that sense are kind of clear when it comes to what family you're born into, and what that means about what you're supposed to do.
Indeed. So they're introduced as priests of the Lord, and Elkanah also sacrificed. And to show that he is a Levite, we're told in verse 4, he would give portions to his wives and sons and daughters there, and only the priests receive those portions. So that really helps nail it down that he's truly a Levite.
So then this is interesting. We're kind of given all of this this information about who he is, which what would seem to be significant because of exactly what you were saying, that if he is a priest, we want to know that he's a legitimate priest, because later on this is going to come up to the idea of, well, is Samuel legitimately a priest, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like how you have with Aaron and Moses, right, in Exodus, how you get their ancestry that sketches its way back, not giving like all the names, but traces it, loosely back to Levi to show the legitimacy of that role. So we kind of have, okay, or it's interesting because it's like we have all the credentials there so that, if this man has a son, we would expect that he could legitimately be a priest. But we're told, like you were saying, well, he has 2 wives, so maybe we should talk about that. And there's only children by one of the 2 wives. So this feels a lot like the situation with Jacob, right, with his 2 wives. It feels a little bit like the situation with Abraham, right, and his wives. So, this is not an unfamiliar situation in the Bible that you've got 2 wives and only one of them can have children.
Right. It's a familiar situation, but it is an uncomfortable one.
Yeah.
Because therefore a man will leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the 2 will become one flesh.
Mm-hmm.
That is how it's supposed to be, Genesis 2:24. That gets quoted in all of the main readings you'd hear at a Lutheran Christian wedding,
Mm-hmm.
Ephesians 5, and also our Lord's quote of that in Matthew, plus what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. You have that one flesh union of one man, one woman for life upheld in the New Testament, when Paul instructs Timothy and Titus that one of the qualifications of pastors, of deacons, is that they be the husband of one wife, man of one woman, literally in the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
But we see this with Sarah and Hagar as well, with the interpretation of that and another of Paul's epistles. That's very, very powerful, the 2 mountains, the 2 women. And the rivalry that you have here is also very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It sounds like something from a polygamous sitcom,
Mm-hmm.
that her rival used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her. That behavior, as well as what we see from Eli and his sons later on, comes at such a contrast to this priestly office of the sacrifice, of everything that's been in place since the tabernacle, the temple tent, was placed at Shiloh all the way back there in Joshua at the beginning of the wars of the Lord. And to have it move from where it is now in 1 Samuel 1 to where it will be at the end of 2 Samuel, Jerusalem, shows you something major about these events, of the shift of the main sanctuary and the movement of God's gracious presence.
Right. Yeah. This is it is interesting how, like you were saying, on the one hand, there's this tension that on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, we have Levitical priests, right? It's in Shiloh, which is, where, Joshua moved the tabernacle to, right? So like on the one hand, it's like, I mean, they are worshiping also the Lord, right? So, and they're going up as required, right? Like we have those certain festivals every year where the men are to go up, right, regardless of where they're at. And so this is good. He's living in Ephraim, but he goes up to Shiloh where the tabernacle is at. So, I mean, there's a lot of good things. But as you were saying, there are a lot of things that actually, in the context of the story, are actually just meant to indicate that things are not quite right. And, we shouldn't take the fact that they're mentioned in the story as a tacit permission or endorsement. But this is a warts and all story, and we want to talk about some of those warts a little bit more. But it's time for our break, so hold that thought, everybody. We're looking at 1 Samuel now, chapter 1 on Thy Strong Word. We'll be right back. turn down the promos for a second. So yeah, Paul, I saw your question there.
I'm Pastor Ken Bomberger. Join me weekday mornings
I'm trying
at
to where
7:15 for
hopefully
Orati.
sometime in the second half we'll have a chance to
Time of
talk about it. But
scripture,
that timeline stuff,
and
it's
music
really
on
helpful.
KFUO. Christ for you.
If you're into
anytime.
timeline stuff, the Concordia commentary on 1 Samuel is really good for that stuff because you got Andrew Steinman as the author, and he is like, I don't know if there's anyone in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod who's more interested in timelines than he is, or not just interested, but well versed in them. So yeah, he has like all kinds of timelines put together, and he gets into some of the chronological issues in the book. So yeah, so if you take a look like on page like 13, he gets into the theological issues or chronological issues, and yeah, I think the overlapping thing is one way to solve some of those problems. Personally, I don't really have a horse in that race on how to figure that out, but yeah, I mean, I would just refer you to that really. And then let me see here. Oh yeah. And your question here about the polygamy. Welcome back, everybody, to Thy Strong Word. I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 1, just talking about how this story is, the good and the bad. It's not like this is a sanitized or, just a whitewashed kind of story right here. It's given us everything. And in that way, it fits a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, whether it's the stories of how Abraham, was lying about his wife and he said, hey, guys, like, here, she's my sister, treat her well, and we're all reading that like, what is Abraham doing? So no, this is a story that isn't pulling any punches and it's just giving you both the good and the bad. And we want to talk a little bit about the bad here in just a minute. With our guest here, we got Pastor Paul Kane, pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Sheridan, Wyoming. If you've got a question or comment for me and Pastor Kane, give us a call if you're listening live, 1-800-730-2727, or if you're in St. Louis, 314-821-0850. You can also hop on the live stream, facebook.com/AJ Espinosa. Got a couple questions there. I want to talk about this one about the polygamy comment there. Also, you can send questions in via email, kfuo@kfuo.org. Got a few questions coming in via email. Want to talk, one of these about the speaking in the heart. It's really fascinating how, we think of silently praying as just kind of a normal thing, but Eli sees it and assumes that she's drunk. So want to talk about that a little bit. So we can email your questions as well. Want to thank our underwriters at the Lutheran Heritage Foundation. Thank you guys for your support of Thy Strong Word. Their website, lhfmissions.org. So let's get back to this, though. The story that's, warts and all. So you've got, he's got two wives, and it's pretty clear, I think, from the story why he has two wives, that he didn't have any children with the one, and he's got a number of children, sons and daughters, right? Now, I mean, later on, he says, he makes this comment that you're saying, like, does he sound kind of tone deaf? Well, maybe so. I don't want to take a look at that. But he says, am I not more to you than 10 sons? That's unclear if that means that his other wife had, 10 children, or if it's just kind of, hyperbole, right? But in any case, it's like, it's clear what's going on. This man like took a second wife, so he would have children, and not be childless. And, that's something that happened in the Old Testament, but something, as you were saying, that God repeatedly says, don't do that. But I mean, then again, the Old Testament's constantly showing us that people do this left and right? I mean, God says, don't worship other gods, and they keep doing that too, right?
They do. There's at least 15 Israelite men, including two of the patriarchs, that are portrayed as polygamous.
Yeah.
Abraham, Jacob, Gideon, David, Solomon, Lamech, Esau, Ahab, Jehoiachin, Jeremiel, Asher, Shaharaim, Rehoboam's sons, Abijah, Jehoram, Joash, Zedekiah. It's overwhelming, but my impression is most men only have one. No man in the New Testament is specifically portrayed as having more than one wife, but Josephus from history tells us that Herod the Great, the infamous Herod the Great, had multiple wives.
Yeah.
You can go to back to the Pentateuch and find laws specifically for cases of polygamy. What we read here in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel sounds a lot like Exodus 21:10. If he takes another wife for himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Deuteronomy 17 has a law limiting Israelite kings. Deuteronomy 21 talks about inheritances, anticipating that there are going to be problems with jealousy and inheritance law, especially if there are children and one wife is loved and one isn't.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That like this is that there all the details too kind of speak to this. I mean, even actually when it talks, you mentioned the word like rival there. Like when I read that, I was thinking back on where was that? It was in it was like in Leviticus. Leviticus 18:18. You shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister. Right. So it didn't say anywhere in the text that these two are sisters. But there's just kind of this idea of, as you were saying, there's other texts as well where there is a, clearly there's a categorical prohibition against polygamy, or at least in the case of bigamy here, right? But on top of that, there are rules that say, well, if you do this thing, which is not good, then you can't make it even worse and add insult to injury, right? And so there's limitations and exclusions on top of that. None of that ever saying that it's ever okay. Like as long as they're not related, or as long as you give Hannah a double portion, then you're in the clear. But just basically it's like you can upgrade your misdemeanor to a felony, right? So it's like don't go and make it worse.
Yeah. Paul reminds us that Christian marriage is a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his church.
Yeah.
There's one bride, there's one bridegroom, and that still is God's will for us.
Right.
But I like your illustration of the misdemeanor and the felony. I'll have to borrow that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got like stuff like that, I think, kind of throughout the scriptures where. And I think it's really kind of indicative also of where there's a law that gets frequently broken, right? That you kind of have to go and step in and provide extra guidance, right? And I mean, it does speak, I think, to the mercy of God that He doesn't just say like, well, all the people who break this law, we're going to execute them all, so there's no need for additional laws. But He says, I know you guys. Isn't that kind of what like the conversation between Moses and God is, right? In Exodus, right? Like, I know these people; they're stubborn. They don't listen.
Right.
And God, and yet God shows mercy for the people involved here. So Hannah is the recipient of some mercy. It is really fascinating how it's described. It says, but to Hannah He gave a double portion because He loved her. And I don't think we necessarily are to take that as like He didn't love His other wife, or something along those lines. But I think what's just trying to be said here is that I guess Hannah was His favored wife. Like Hannah, I think, was the one, which I think kind of maybe goes back to that suggestion that maybe Hannah really was the first wife. the one he fell in love with. And so to his credit, he's he's treating her well, and he's taking care of her, right? So you have that going on. And the thing with verse 8, I mean, is this him being tone deaf, or I don't know. I think I tend to read this a little bit sympathetically, like he's trying to. I mean, like he might be doing a bad job, but he's trying to be consoling, right? He's like, hey Hannah, yeah, I know you don't have kids, right? But you have me, right? And I'm taking care of you, yeah. Because I think in the Old Testament context, you thought of children in a lot of ways as people who are going to take care of you, right? Like you're getting old and you don't have pensions or IRAs or anything like that. And so he's like, hey, look, I'm taking good care of you. I'm a Levite. God's taking care of us. We're doing well. Like, and I love you, and I'm giving you a double portion. Like, you're gonna be fine. Don't be afraid that think of Leah, right? How Leah was, the thing with Leah and Rachel, how it was like, oh, I don't have a kid. If I don't have a kid, Jacob's never gonna love me. Like, Lord, please give me children so that my husband will love me. And so, he is, I think, maybe speaking to that fear that Hannah might have at the time. Like, is he going to stop loving me because I don't have kids for him? So maybe it's not so terrible what he says, even if it's not the best thing.
Yeah, he gets points for trying and for being there. He didn't abandon her. He didn't turn her out. This is not a Hagar moment.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, the parallel with Rachel and Leah, that one may be more apt. Yeah,
right. Just the rivalry and the well, if we can have kids, then I'll be loved more. And I mean, and in that sense, I think it does set it up for some big questions that link back to us then, in terms of what here in this story is everyone valuing or perhaps even idolizing, right? Because on the one hand, it seems like everyone in the story on a certain level is faithful, right? They go up and they make the sacrifices. They pray to the Lord. They make vows to the Lord, right? And it's not to Baal, right? So it's kind of like you were saying, well, they get some points for trying, right? But the thing is, it seems like everyone in this story here is just kind of off, though. I mean, like Hannah just has to have a son. And she's not going to be happy about anything until she does. Elkanah is to be fair, is the same way, because he was so insistent that he have children that he married a second woman. So it's kind of like everyone in this story is kind of wanting to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, even Eli.
Yep.
His comments about her, well, what we're told, he took her to be a drunken woman, may say more about him than about Hannah. But I love how things switch up by verse 28.
Yeah.
Therefore I have lent him, I have dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. So in a way, to finish your idolatry comment, so many parents do idolize their children, try to be their buddy instead of their parent, or even have as a false god the idea of having children or the right number or the right gender. She's flipped that on its head and gave him back when he was weaned. I mean, the boy was a boy, verse 24.
Yeah.
The child was young.
Yeah.
3 years old? A mom giving up a 3-year-old? He's not even in kindergarten yet.
Yeah. All this stuff in the Bible that...
Lord have mercy.
All this stuff in the Bible that I just can't even think about with a straight face anymore now that I have kids. The worst thing is when I watch The Prince of Egypt, the DreamWorks adaptation of the Exodus story, and the opening number with Moses' mother singing to baby Moses as she sets him in the basket. I can't even describe that without getting misty-eyed now. It's ridiculous, but I really appreciate your point, though, that one of the greatest difficulties that we have as Christian parents is avoiding the temptation, especially in our Western society, to idolize our children. And I mean, I mean, I think it happens in every age. Here in this ancient context, they idolize having children. Here, as it was with Rachel and Leah, a woman in that situation, she feels like she has no value unless she has a child. Whereas, all of us who have faith in God should be seeing our value as his sons and daughters, as his creatures, and not in what we accomplish or in our abilities and or any of the rest of it. So I do like your point that in the end, we are God is really being gracious to Hannah here. And even if Hannah is perhaps unduly bent on having a child, he's moving her to the right spot where she's seeing that the child, and then ultimately even life itself, is on loan from God. I mean, this is exactly what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians about stewardship. We change our perspective and we look at it all as none of this is ours. My life isn't mine. My kids aren't mine. I mean, ultimately, it's all God's, and I'm just taking care of this stuff for Him for a time. And that's a really hard thought, I think, that for us as Western modern parents to think of it like that. That as you were saying rightly, like instead of like oh, this kid's mine, and I'm gonna make sure that I'm buddy with them, and they're always gonna like me, and all the rest of it, and instead seeing it as what this child is ultimately God's child. He's given me the gracious task of taking care of this child for however many years. May God grant that we take care of our children more than 3 years, but we're just really taking care of them for a time on His behalf.
Yes, it's back to stewardship, as you mentioned. They are a blessing from God. I'm blessed to be headmaster of a school, and we get started the day after Labor Day. I love the attitude of the Mother of our Lord, where she says, "Let it be to me according to your word." And depending on the Lord as our insurance policy, instead of children or an insurance policy, is really the best thing. It helps us avoid that idolatry, but also entrust ourselves to God's rich grace and mercy, single, married, with children, not blessed in that way. We can certainly understand what she's going through. It just tugs at our heartstrings, most definitely. And to have the echoes of take your son, your only son who you love, and sacrifice him to me, and how that gets us, brought into the New Testament with, for God so loved the world, He gave His only Son for us. It may have cost us nothing, but it cost the Father everything in Jesus.
And then that picture of giving, and giving over entirely, even. This, I think, gets to the wordplay that's going on with the name Samuel itself, and we should maybe talk about that a little bit here, because I think that we skipped ahead here to the end in verse 28. Where she says this, therefore I've lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he's lent to the Lord. Earlier in verse 20, it says, in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I've asked for him from the Lord. And so this is one of these, wordplay moments, like where it seems like all these biblical names come from. And the footnote for the ESV is helpful. Samuel sounds like the Hebrew for heard of God. And I think there's actually a number of names that kind of basically mean, gift from God or abundance of God. I mean, Elizabeth actually is kind of means something similar there. But I think there's maybe even more going on with the name Samuel.
His name is God. Right.
Yeah. So what do you think is going on here then with the name Samuel and maybe some of the other connections that we're supposed to be seeing?
Well, it may be more than one thing at the same time. His name is El. His name is God. Could easily suggest his parents' confession that Samuel's God is the one true God, the only, in the midst of all of the idolatry and even worthless men that we meet in chapter 2 in a fuller way.
Right.
Yes, the heard of God, heard by God.
Yeah.
The preposition could go either way, that the name Samuel sounds like these other Hebrew words, which just makes it fun to look into the original languages, even in a small way, as a start, if you don't want to go through a formal class for the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a confession that the God is the one true God, and he has been gracious and merciful to us. His power is stronger than our weakness and barrenness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like your idea there with his name is Ale, because you could take that with the consonants instead of Shemuel. You could make it Shemoel, which would be his name is Ale. And if it does mean that, I think the idea, as we've been saying, name being less like what you call him, because Ale, was not really that particularly distinctive, especially in this context. I think a lot of gods would have had some kind of Ale element in their name in the region. Though it could refer to something a little bit more specific, but still not even as specific as like Yahweh, for example. But I think to the idea of his reputation, especially as in his reputation as a faithful God, right? I think that's a little bit one of the big themes here, actually, where it just says there in verse 19, right? And the Lord remembered her, right? Or where else was it here? Yeah, there it is. What Elkanah says in verse 23, do what seems best to you, wait until you've weaned him, only may the Lord establish his word. So I think throughout there's this idea of God being faithful, and that, even if from our perspective it seems like God's letting us down, or, hey, God, why have you still not given me this job? Why have you not still given me this chance? Why have you still not, removed this illness, or this, or even this this person who's really just vexing me from my life, but that in the end he shows himself faithful. So I do like the idea of Shemuel. I think that Shemuel though has a lot going for it. It's actually pointed that way in the Masoretic text. I think one of the other things though, which I think is kind of fun too, is at the end there's a little bit of a, I don't know, maybe this is a pun or not, but at the end you get another related or similar sounding word, which is Shaul, instead of Shemuel, you just kind of take out the M, as it were. You just get Shaul, which is to say he is lent. So his name even kind of plays on that side of things, and I really like that idea, because it's just this idea that we God hears our prayers, right? We ask him for things, and ultimately the best thing that we can do then is to give those things back to him, right? God gives us his gifts so that we can give them to others, and that we would sacrifice them, just as you were saying, of course, like as he has shown us with his own son. So I think there's yet another connection, maybe with a little bit of the word play there, that she has asked. She says, Sha'alti, right? I've asked from him. He heard, right? And then she lends back to God, all using these very, very similar sounding words.
Indeed. And I don't know if there's intentional Hebrew foreshadowing, because this Hebrew word for Lent or dedicated does look a lot like Saul.
It does, actually,
the first king.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I actually had not thought about that, what might be going on there. But yeah, so definitely just a lot of connections, like a lot that's just very suggestive and stuff to just kind of ponder. But I think getting back to that idea that we are rightly using God's gifts when we recognize that we're but stewards of them, and they're from Him and they go back to Him, really, and they're not meant for us to hoard. And so whether that's even our own children. So yeah, there's a lot, I think, there for us as well. Let's talk, though, a little bit here about, you mentioned Eli. This is interesting, right? And so one of the questions that came in was, okay, what is this, speaking in her heart, it says, right? It's fascinating that Eli would, for our perspective, be like, jump to the conclusion of you're drunk, right? Like, because we think to ourselves, well, don't people pray quietly all the time? So one of the questions that came in over email was, is this speaking in her heart that Hannah does, is it like the groaning mentioned in Romans 8:26, which is that what the groanings of the Spirit too deep for words? Is that for that text? To look at it, Romans 8:26.
Yeah, I do like that assertion that the Spirit does pray in groans that words cannot express, Abba, Father. I found something, our school here is a classical Lutheran school.
Yeah.
And one of the things we learned from the classical period is it was a very rare thing in classical times, biblical times, for someone to just sit there and read something silently to themselves.
Right.
Curling up with a good book, that was just not done because there weren't that many scrolls.
Oh, and not many people
even in the time
who could
of the
read.
New Testament.
Most people couldn't.
Oh, yeah. So for someone to just sit there silently and read was virtually unheard of until the modern era.
Yeah.
And so, too, if you're praying, it would usually be done out loud so people would know what's going on. And Eli, he only sees her lips moving and takes her as a drunken woman. And she says, no, I'm troubled in spirit. I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Don't regard me as a worthless woman. And then not knowing what her prayer was, because she said it silently in her heart, in her mind. He says, go in peace, not merely have a nice day, but he blesses her. How amazing.
Yeah.
That,
they leave on favorable terms.
Beautiful promise,
right? They leave on favorable terms, even though it was kind of a rocky start, right? And and she respectfully says, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." So at no moment does she say like, "Oh, you mean priest, you're not very compassionate," But yeah, I think you're right that he in some ways kind of makes a natural assumption for his cultural context, which is like, her mouth's moving, but there's no sound coming out. Like, is she okay? Right. But yeah, it's because of this exceptional anxiety and vexation here. And we're going to want to talk about that more too, because I think the bit about wine is, well, it's a hint for what's coming. But thank you so much, brother. A lot of good connections here. Can't even look at it all, but you got the ball rolling for us. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. Privilege.
Everybody, that was Pastor Paul Kane at Emmanuel in Sheridan, Wyoming. We're going to go on to chapter 2. Look at that song, that prayer of Hannah next time. Looking forward to that. Until then, everybody, I'm Pastor A.J. Espinosa. Peace.
The official broadcast ministry of the LCMS. Your support is vital for this program to continue. You can make a gift safe, secure, and easily online at KFUO.org. Thank you for listening and supporting Thy